Hello again. I must apologise for not responding to comments for the last day or two, but I'm staying with family members looking after babies and so on, which means that I'm not online all that much. Normal service will be resumed later today, though. In the last few decades, a very odd idea has been developed and promoted in Europe and the United States. It is to this effect that until around the 16th or 17th century, there was no racism anywhere in the world. This was because there was no concept of race. People simply didn't think in those terms. The Roman Empire was diverse, and the ancient Greeks had no idea of discriminating between races because they didn't think that black people were any different from them. All ethnic groups coexisted amicably. And in Africa and Asia, North and South America and Australia, the human race was one big happy family. Well, you can guess what happened to ruin this state of nature, can't you? It was those pesky white people, of course. Round about the time of the Industrial Revolution, they began to get into colonialism and slavery. A justification was needed for the exploitation of and cruelty towards Africans, the Native Americans, Australian Aborigines, and all the dark-skinned people in the world who up to that time had been living in harmony. So we in Europe devised the idea of dividing humanity up into a hierarchy of races, with of course the white race at the top of the tree. This meant that because we were so superior, we had a right to take advantage of other and less developed cultures, to steal from them, and enslave their people. This was the birth of racism. It's a pretty good theory, at least for everybody who is not white, because it means that we can be blamed for all the racial prejudice which we see in the world. In fact, white people can be blamed for practically anything. Many white people have bought into this fantasy and so are eager to be nice to black people and give them jobs, university places, and money as compensation for our past beastly behaviour towards them. The only trouble is, of course, there is not a word of truth in all this. Throughout the whole course of recorded history, every civilization, culture, or group of people has exhibited at best mistrust and at worst hostility and hatred to those who are different from them, either in language, religion, skin colour, shape of eyes, or anything else which marks them out as being outsiders to the other group. The best example of this awful tendency may of course be seen in Africa, and it took place thousands of years before any white people showed up there and started behaving like racists. In appearance, the Bantu are what most of us think of when we hear mention of black Africans. If we imagine somebody from the modern country of Nigeria or Ghana, this tells us what the Bantu look like. The more African ancestry they have, the more that people of Caribbean heritage, African Americans, and other black people in the Western world resemble the Bantu. For most of us, this is the default setting when we think of black people. But there's a little more to this than meets the eye. The evidence suggests that between 3000 and 2500 BC, the Bantu, which were one ethnic group in Africa, began cultivating yams, that's to say, planting and harvesting them, thus establishing farming as a way of life in an area not far from modern Nigeria. These people had no understanding of fertilizers or the depletion of nutrients in soil they had been cultivating for a year or two. All they knew was that fresh land grew bigger yams, which meant tilling new fields every few years. So it was that after a few centuries of this, the Bantu began moving south and east from their ancestral homeland, which led them in one direction into the forests of Central Africa and in the other to the savannas of the south. And there they came into contact with the two other major ethnic groups which inhabited sub-Saharan Africa at that time. The greater part of Africa in 2,500 BC was divided between the people we now think of as pygmies and also the Khoi, sometimes known as Bushmen, although the expression is now regarded as impolite and verging on the offensive. The Pygmies, who were considerably smaller than the Bantu, lived in the vast forest which covered equatorial Africa at that time. Although we speak casually of the Pygmies, they may be divided into three groups, namely the Umbuti, Kwa, and Mbenga. The differences between these ethnic groups of Pygmies is difficult for Europeans to identify. It has been speculated that their lack of height was caused by the forest environment in which they dwelt in an analogous fashion to the phenomenon known as island dwarfism. In the east and south of Africa live the Khoi. The Khoi have the most ancient lineage of any human population in the world. They might be said to be the original humans. At the time of which we are speaking, they ranged over the whole of southern and eastern Africa. Although they were mostly like the Pygmies hunter-gatherers, the Khoi were on the cusp of pastoralism. This meant that some of them were keeping herds of animals which moved with their owners in a similar way to the wandering Bedouin of the Sinai Peninsula, who roamed the desert with their flocks of goats. The Khoi were very different in appearance to the Bantu. For one thing, their skin was much paler, and for another, their facial features had more in common with people living in East Asia than they do with the Bantu. Like most people from East Asia, the Khoi had an epicanthic eye fold. The Bantu practiced slash and burn agriculture. They would chop down a section of forest and then burn the logs. All this would enrich the soil for a few years, and so they would settle and plant yams. When the yields began to decline, they simply moved to a new part of the forest and repeated the process. In this way, they gradually expanded into the lands of both Pygmies and the Khoisan. The Pygmies and Khoi who resisted this encroachment upon their territory would have been at a huge disadvantage. Both groups were physically slighter than the Bantu, who were tall, healthy, and strong with a steady diet of nutritious food. As they colonized the continent, they killed, mated with, or enslaved those with whom they came into contact. Today, the Bantu rule supreme in Africa, and the Pygmies and Khoisan live only in fragmented and geographically isolated pockets of land. This kind of genocide and slavery was pretty much the rule in the rest of the world too, although perhaps not on such a ghastly scale as practiced by the Bantu. Racism and racial prejudice were a way of life in the world 5,000 years ago, long before white people even thought of colonialism and slavery. It is, and always has been, the way of the world. I wrote a piece on my Substack account touching upon this question, and I give a link to it in the description to this video. It is, of course, free to read.